Ability, the podcast from the ARC Southern Maryland. I'm Rita Rich. This is the first of our occasional talks with parents who become professionals. Meet Calvert County, Maryland native Guy Stevens. He is the founder and executive director of a group called the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint. See My Ability, talked to Guy via Zoom this past July.
If you went back 6 years ago, I worked for a university, was doing work actually for the Environmental Protection Agency. I had been in my job for well over 20 years and had no inclination to start a nonprofit and to kind of take my career in a very different direction. But what happened is what often happens to change things, a personal experience. As you mentioned, I have a son who's neurodivergent. He unfortunately experienced physical restraint and seclusion in a Maryland school. Now, if you went back a number of years and mentioned to me restraint and seclusion, and you mentioned it in the context of a school, I probably would have looked at you somewhat blankly. I don't know that I would have imagined that physical restraint and seclusion were things that might be done to a child in school. I certainly don't know that I would have imagined that these are things that might have been done to a child with a disability in a school. And to be clear, when I'm talking about physical restraint, what I'm talking about is something that people often think about more in a law enforcement setting than a school setting. It really is holding someone, and there's lots of ways you can hold people, but it's holding someone and preventing them from moving on their own. There are standing restraints, there are seated restraints, there are restraints that someone is on the ground, like a prone restraint or supine restraint. And many people are familiar with restraint because they've heard the stories of individuals who have actually died being physically restrained. And unfortunately, this is something that's happened in schools across the nation as well. So at any rate, I had a son who experienced being physically restrained and secluded at school. And when we talk about seclusion, really what we're talking about, and while the definitions vary from state to state, the basic idea behind seclusion is you're putting an individual in a room or area against their will, and you're not letting them out. So essentially, a child's having a difficult time. You put them in a small, maybe padded room, maybe plywood room. You shut the door and you don't let them out. People often do this under the impression that somehow it will help a dysregulated human somehow to regulate. But I'll tell you, there is nothing regulating about being put into a room against your will and not let out. It's actually really traumatic.
Let me jump in. You said that students have died in schools across our country because they were restrained against their will and have died. Now, it's not like it makes headlines every day, but a sizable number. Have you been able to track it?
Absolutely. I mean, it may not make headlines every day, but it certainly has made headlines. Back in 2009, the United States Government Accountability Office, which is basically a government watchdog that's a government agency, the GAO did a report, and the report was titled Restraint and Seclusion, Selected Instances of Death and Abuse at Public and Private Schools and Treatment Centers. So over a decade ago, the Government Accountability Office did this report. They did an investigation, and they found there were hundreds of instances of death and abuse happening due to the use of restraint and seclusion in schools across the nation. Now, more recently, in fact, when my son, around the same time my son was last physically restrained and secluded, this would have been in the fall of 2018, across the country in California, there was a young man, autistic like my son, like science, like nature, like the outdoors, like my son. He was at a school where he was put into a prone restraint and it killed him. His name was Max Benson. I've met some of the members of Max's family. His neighbor is a volunteer on our team. I think about Max. Max was the same age as my son when this happened. And yeah, kids have died being physically restrained. Max became dysregulated. He kicked a wall. He was upset and he ended up being physically restrained. There was a young man not much later named Cornelius Frederick. Cornelius Frederick was in a specialized school in Michigan. He became dysregulated. He threw a sandwich. He ended up being put into a primary restraint that killed him. There have been numerous cases of death due to the use of physical restraint. So, I mean, it is something that's pretty serious. And there have been efforts going back well over a decade to pass federal law. One of the problems with restraint and seclusion is there is no federal law that provides oversight to the use of restraint and seclusion in schools across the nation. There are federal laws in other settings like law enforcement and medical settings, but nothing in our schools. And what that means is that every state is on their own in terms of what their laws say or don't say. In Maryland, my home state, we happen to have some of the stronger laws in the nation around this. However, they did not prevent what happened to my son. And if you look at what the state law in Maryland said, my son actually should not have been restrained and secluded. Our law followed federal guidance. So we don't have federal law, but there was pretty strong federal guidance that came out in 2012. And that guidance said you don't restrain or seclude an individual unless it's a crisis situation. You've tried all the other things that you can try, and it's needed to avoid the potential of imminent serious physical harm. Imminent serious physical harm has a legal definition. It's a 4-part definition, but the basic idea behind it is a life-threatening situation. So the federal government said, you don't do these things unless it's a potentially life-threatening situation. And I believe that was for good reason, because we know kids have died being physically restrained. When do you use potentially deadly force on a dysregulated child with a disability? It should be exceedingly rare. Now, there are cases where a kid is going to jump in front of a moving vehicle, or someone has something that could be a weapon and could really do physical harm to someone. There are cases where it might be necessary. We happen to believe that seclusion is never anything that should be done to a child, and restraint should really be fairly rare. But despite the laws that we have, I mean, my son was restrained and secluded for one time splashing water, one time because he threw a book, not at anybody, just threw a book. What we find in reality is that it's not that life-threatening situation, but it's non-compliance. It's disrespect. It's minor behaviors. It's behaviors that are sometimes unintentionally escalated. So a child's having a hard time. They're not meeting the expectation. And one of the natural responses sometimes is to demand compliance. When we demand compliance from someone who's already dysregulated, what tends to happen is they become more dysregulated. And very often that leads to kind of a fight or flight state where a kid's going to run out of a room, knock something over, scream, spit. And that is what very often leads to a physical restraint or seclusion.
Guy and I then discussed possible steps other than restraint and seclusion that parents, teachers, and others in authority can use.
I just spent the last year and a half working very closely with a company named Crisis Prevention Institute. Crisis Prevention Institute is a company that is known for teaching de-escalation skills and physical restraint. And you might wonder why on earth the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint was working with a crisis management company that was teaching the use of restraint. Turns out that after many conversations, we realized that we had similar goals. They were aligned with us in eliminating seclusion and reducing the use of restraint. Well, to your question, what we spent the last 18 months doing was developing an entirely new training program to train teachers and staff. And the program is something called Reframing Behavior. It's actually begun rolling out to schools with an intent of rolling out to other settings as well over time. But the whole idea of the program is what I was talking about, going upstream, getting people to see behavior differently. But the program we developed was actually designed to be taught to everyone in a school. It was designed to be taught to a teacher, a paraprofessional, an administrator, a bus driver, a cafeteria worker. And this is trying to kind of make this science approachable. If I said to you, okay, all your staff need to learn neuroscience, that sounds kind of scary. But when we put together this kind of training, and that's what the goal was, how do we help people shift in a better direction? Because a lot of the change that needs to happen is a change in the adult mindset and response. And yeah, absolutely. So, that's kind of how we do it is, yes, I mean, it does sound overwhelming, but, there are some amazing people out there that are doing work that is aimed directly at people that might be working in direct care or residential settings. I met with somebody recently who had developed a crisis management program entirely hands-off, but aimed at those settings, and a lot of the work being done out there. Low arousal is a approach that was developed by a group in the UK called Studio 3. It's been used in a lot of the settings that you were mentioning earlier. So yes, some training and change needs to happen. Absolutely. But there are approachable ways of doing that now. And it's important. One of my other favorite quotes, and I say this a lot, but it's the Maya Angelou quote, right? Do the best you can until you know better. And when you know better, do better. And if you think about that, sometimes, when we don't know better, we're doing things that might be causing harm. And it's not because we want to, but it's because it's what we know. And we have an opportunity now, I think, to, in our, different programs, begin to implement things and help us to do better.
Then Guy and I dove into what needs to happen to help direct support staff, teachers' aides, power educators, and others understand brain science and look at people differently.
Our work, at the Alliance has kind of evolved. While we started out very much focused on the issue of restraint and seclusion, it's really broader than that. It's not just restraint and seclusion. In the context of a school, it might be restraint, seclusion, suspension, expulsion, corporal punishment. It's this idea of the school to prison pipeline as well. What we know are the same kids that are having a lot of punitive things, a lot of exclusionary things done to them are far more likely to end up in a school context becoming disengaged. If you are always on the other side of exclusionary and punitive discipline, if you are not included, you are going to find yourself far more likely to not feel safe, not feel engaged. And as that happens, you see a lot of disengagement. School does not feel welcoming. It doesn't feel like a place you want to be. And when disengagement happens, we see school refusal. We see people that begin to drop out and not go. And the likelihood, and in fact, if you look at the data here, the likelihood of kind of traveling down that school to prison pipeline increases. If we look at the kids that are being restrained, secluded, suspended, expelled, subjected to corporal punishment, we still have 17 states that allow that. If you look at that, those are the same children that are more likely to end up in juvenile justice and in the criminal justice system. Over 60% of prisoners and inmates across the country identify with having some sort of disability. That is a failure upstream, and we need to do better. And ultimately, when we talk about supporting adults, when we talk about supporting individuals that may have had a less than optimal experience getting to where they are, what we know today is that trauma changes the brain. And I don't mean that to be figurative. There are actually changes in the brain that occur due to traumatic experiences. So when we're not doing the best we can when kids are young, that carries over into traumatic experiences. That trauma leads to what we might term as hypervigilance. Somebody that is a person that's experienced a lot of trauma tends to be hypervigilant, tends to be kind of more on alert, tends to be more easily triggered. And individuals that are hypervigilant are more likely to have what we would term as stress behavior or distress behavior. And that big behavior that happens, that big behavior that leads to a lot of concern, very often is met with those compliance demands. So a kid and individuals having a hard time, what do? We get right up in their face and we begin to tell them what they need to do. Sometimes what you don't do is more important. Taking a step backwards, using a calming voice, making yourself smaller, becoming less threatening. There's things that we can do to try to help de-escalate, but often we tend to kind of push. And when we push, there comes the fight or flight response when somebody just really and when a fight or flight response happens, our prefrontal cortex, no matter who you are, your prefrontal cortex, a thinking, logical, rational, decision-making part of your brain, kind of goes offline. And you're not really thinking as much as you are responding and reacting. What we need to do is try to get people back in kind of that thinking, rational brain to help them to become regulated. But often our instincts or our training push us in the other direction. We have to control the situation. And in doing that, we see things that really, really escalate. So again, we want to impact exclusion. We want to impact punitive discipline. We want to impact the school to prison pipeline. We really have to go upstream and better support individuals kind of throughout their lifetime.
Some last thoughts from Guy Stevens. As we expect our kids and adults to learn new and more socially accepted behaviors, we all need to be willing to evolve our approaches to all people in our lives. It's a very human experience, trauma. Even people who haven't been diagnosed with any kind of intellectual disability. So you've got people who are teachers, who are professors, who are vice presidents, presidents of huge corporations, even countries, have gone through trauma.
I mentioned to you kind of the program that we were working to develop, and a lot of the work that we do is really starting with the adult, starting with the caregiver. This isn't about what we do or how we are with other people as much as it is starting with us. I mean, even if you begin to dive into some of this and understand your own behavior through the lens of the brain and the nervous system, understand what it means when you become dysregulated. Equip yourself with things that you can do to help yourself to regain a state of regulation if you're becoming dysregulated. We often say, in the context that a lot of my work is done in kind of the school setting, a dysregulated adult is never going to help a dysregulated child. That carries over to working with adults as well. If we are dysregulated, we're not going to help somebody who's having a hard time. So a lot of this work really begins with us. It begins with the parent, the caregiver, the staff, the teacher, the educator, and giving ourselves some grace as well. I mean, you're right. This is a challenging, it seems ever more challenging every day world. And there's a lot of stressors out there for all of us. But I happen to believe it can make a huge difference when we are able to look at ourselves through that lens and again, provide ourselves a grace, but also learn more about our own existence and how we can help ourselves. Because it's like that seatbelt analogy on the plane, right? Put your own seatbelt on, or, whatever it may be, the oxygen mask. That's what I was thinking, right? So, rather than, trying to help somebody else first, sometimes you have to help yourself first. And, again, some of these jobs are really difficult jobs, really challenging jobs, can be very difficult. So again, all of this begins with us and then carries over to the people that we are helping and there to, serve and work with.
To find out more about Guy Stevens' Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint, see endseclusion.org on the web. To find this and other episodes of See Me, See My Ability, please see arcsomd.org and find us on any of the popular podcasting apps. See Me, See My Ability, the podcast of the ARC Southern Maryland, where more than meets the eye. I'm Rita Rich.